For more than 600 years, the Ottoman Empire refused to disappear, surviving plagues, invasions, revolutions, and the rise of entirely new worlds around it. While countless kingdoms rose and fell in its shadow, this empire adapted, negotiated, and endured against odds that destroyed its rivals. How did a small frontier state grow into a global power, and then survive centuries of crisis without collapsing overnight? The answer reveals a story not of endless conquest, but of quiet strength, calculated flexibility, and survival against time itself. Before we begin, this channel explores history through stories, not just dates. If that interests you, you may subscribe and join us. The story of the Ottoman Empire does not begin with grandeur or inevitability. It begins quietly, on the shifting frontier between the fading Byzantine world and the restless Turkic principalities of Anatolia in the late 13th century. In this uncertain borderland, power was fragile, loyalty was personal, and survival depended on adaptability rather than tradition. It was here, among raiders, farmers, dervishes, and warriors, that a small beylik led by Osman ibn Ertugrul took shape, unaware that it was laying the foundations for one of history's longest-lasting empires. At the time, the region was defined by collapse. The Seljuk Sultanate of Rum had fragmented under Mongol pressure, leaving behind a patchwork of rival principalities. Byzantium, once the unchallenged power of the eastern Mediterranean, was weakened by civil war, economic decline, and the loss of its Anatolian heartland. This environment rewarded leaders who could attract followers, distribute land, and promise both material gain and spiritual purpose. The early Ottomans succeeded not because they were stronger than their rivals, but because they were more flexible. From the beginning, the Ottoman state was not built around rigid ethnic or tribal identity. It was built around opportunity. Warriors from many backgrounds joined Ottoman ranks, drawn by the prospect of land, loot, and status on a frontier where boundaries were fluid. The Ottomans absorbed local customs, allowed religious diversity, and avoided alienating conquered populations. This pragmatism, often overlooked, became one of the empire's greatest strengths and would remain central to its longevity. As the Ottoman territory expanded in the 14th century, its rulers began to transform a frontier warband into an organized state. This transformation was slow and deliberate. Institutions were not imposed suddenly but evolved in response to real needs. Land was distributed through the Timar system, which tied military service directly to agricultural revenue. Soldiers were rewarded not with hereditary estates, but with conditional rights that could be revoked, ensuring loyalty to the central authority rather than to family lineage. At the same time, the Ottomans placed great emphasis on law and legitimacy. Islamic law provided a moral framework, but it was complemented by sultanic regulations designed to govern a complex and growing population. This dual legal system allowed flexibility without chaos, enabling the state to adapt its rules to changing circumstances while maintaining continuity. Order, not ideology, became the guiding principle of governance. The capture of Constantinople in 1453 marked a turning point, but it was not the beginning of Ottoman greatness. It was the confirmation of a system that had already proven its durability. Mehmed II did not rule as a conqueror bent on destruction. He ruled as an administrator determined to preserve and repurpose the city. Churches were converted, but many were left standing. Trade was encouraged, populations were resettled, and the city was restored as a functioning imperial capital. The Ottomans understood that an empire could not survive on conquest alone, it had to manage what it had taken. Over the following centuries, the Ottoman Empire expanded across Southeast Europe, Anatolia, the Middle East, and North Africa. This vast territory encompassed dozens of languages, religions, and cultures. Rather than attempting to erase these differences, the Ottomans institutionalized them. The millet system allowed religious communities a degree of autonomy, enabling them to govern their own internal affairs. This reduced resistance, minimized administrative burden, and fostered a sense of stability among non-Muslim populations. Central to Ottoman endurance was the balance between central authority and local autonomy. Governors were powerful, but their power was temporary. Appointments were rotated, wealth was monitored, and rebellion was met with swift response. The Sultan stood at the center of this system, but he was supported by a professional bureaucracy trained through palace schools and administrative institutions. Talent, not noble birth, determined advancement. This meritocratic tendency, though imperfect, ensured a steady supply of capable officials across generations. The Ottoman military system further reinforced stability. The Devshirme system, controversial yet effective, recruited Christian boys into state service, converting them to Islam and educating them for roles in administration or the elite Janissary corps. These individuals were detached from local power networks and owed their status entirely to the state. For centuries, this created a loyal, disciplined class of servants who strengthened central control and reduced the risk of hereditary military aristocracies challenging the throne. Equally important was the empire's economic adaptability. The Ottomans sat astride major trade routes connecting Europe, Asia, and Africa. They taxed commerce, protected caravans, and invested in infrastructure such as roads, bridges, caravanserais, and ports. While European powers later sought sea routes to bypass Ottoman-controlled trade, the empire adjusted by shifting economic strategies, expanding agricultural production, and integrating new markets rather than collapsing immediately under pressure. Ottoman rulers also understood the importance of continuity. Succession was often brutal, but it was decisive. Civil wars were short, rival claimants were eliminated, and uncertainty was resolved quickly. Stability, even at high human cost, prevented prolonged fragmentation. Over time, succession practices evolved, reducing violence while maintaining order, reflecting the empire's ability to reform itself without abandoning its core structures. Religion, often assumed to be the defining feature of Ottoman rule, functioned less as a tool of domination and more as a framework for coexistence. Islam shaped the identity of the ruling elite, but conversion was rarely forced on a large scale. Loyalty mattered more than belief. This pragmatic tolerance allowed the empire to rule over Christian and Jewish populations for centuries without constant revolt, an achievement few early modern states could match. As the 16th century unfolded, the empire reached its territorial and administrative peak under rulers like Suleiman the Magnificent. Law was codified, institutions were refined, and imperial authority was projected through both force and justice. Yet even at this height, the Ottomans continued to evolve, responding to new challenges rather than relying solely on past successes. It was this capacity for adaptation, rather than military power alone, that sustained the empire as the world around it began to change. The world beyond the Ottoman frontiers was transforming rapidly. European states were centralizing, experimenting with new military technologies, and expanding overseas. The Ottomans did not remain unaware or passive in the face of these changes. Instead, they engaged with them selectively, absorbing what proved useful and resisting what threatened internal balance. Firearms were integrated early into Ottoman warfare, and for a time, the empire stood at the forefront of gunpowder military power. The Janissaries, once an elite infantry force, symbolized this early adaptation. However, longevity brought new challenges. Institutions designed for expansion struggled in an era of stagnation. As conquest slowed, the flow of land and revenue that had sustained the Timar system diminished. In response, the state shifted toward tax farming, monetizing its revenues to meet the demands of a cash-based economy. This transition was imperfect and often exploited, but it demonstrated a willingness to restructure economic foundations rather than cling blindly to older models. Provincial administration also evolved. Local notables, known as ayan, gained influence in distant regions, filling gaps where central authority weakened. Rather than destroying the empire, this decentralization often stabilized it. The Ottomans negotiated power, co-opting local elites instead of fighting endless rebellions. Authority became layered, not absolute, allowing the state to function across vast distances and diverse societies without collapsing under its own weight. The empire's diplomatic culture further contributed to its survival. The Ottomans did not view diplomacy as a sign of weakness. Treaties, truces, and alliances were tools of statecraft, employed alongside warfare. Permanent embassies were established, foreign experts were consulted, and information flowed into Istanbul from across Europe. This awareness of the outside world prevented strategic isolation and allowed the empire to navigate shifting balances of power over centuries. Equally significant was the Ottoman approach to reform. Change came slowly and often met resistance, but it was rarely rejected outright. Military defeats prompted investigation rather than denial. Administrative inefficiencies led to new regulations and experiments. From the 17th century onward, reform-minded officials attempted to restore discipline, curb corruption, and modernize institutions within an Ottoman framework rather than dismantling it entirely. Continuity remained as important as innovation. Social cohesion also played a role. Despite economic hardship and political tension, Ottoman society retained strong communal structures. Religious institutions, guilds, and local courts provided stability at the grassroots level. These networks absorbed shocks that might otherwise have shattered the state. The empire endured not because it was free of crisis, but because crisis was dispersed across multiple layers of society rather than concentrated at the center. Even periods commonly labeled as decline were marked by resilience. Military setbacks did not result in immediate disintegration. Lost territories were often compensated by internal consolidation. Rebellions flared, but they were typically contained. The state adjusted its expectations, shifting from expansion to preservation, from conquest to administration. This recalibration allowed the empire to survive in a world increasingly dominated by industrialized powers. By the 19th century, the pressures intensified. Nationalism, European imperialism, and economic dependency strained the Ottoman system as never before. In response, the state launched ambitious reforms aimed at redefining citizenship, law, and governance. The Tanzimat era sought to centralize authority, standardize administration, and assert sovereignty in a rapidly changing international order. These reforms did not halt decline, but they prolonged imperial life by decades. Throughout its history, the Ottoman Empire demonstrated a rare capacity to absorb contradiction. Tradition coexisted with reform, diversity with authority, faith with pragmatism. Its rulers and institutions repeatedly chose adaptation over rigidity, negotiation over annihilation, and governance over domination. This persistent flexibility, tested across centuries of war, peace, prosperity, and crisis, allowed the Ottoman state to endure far longer than most of its contemporaries. Yet even as reforms multiplied, they exposed the deep tension at the heart of the empire. Efforts to centralize authority often clashed with long-established local practices. New laws promised equality, but they disrupted older systems that had balanced difference through autonomy rather than uniformity. The Ottoman state found itself attempting to modernize while preserving legitimacy among populations whose loyalty had long depended on negotiated relationships, not abstract citizenship. The army, once the backbone of imperial power, reflected these contradictions. Traditional forces resisted modernization, fearing loss of privilege, while reformers pushed for European-style training and organization. Military reform required not only new weapons and tactics, but also new ways of thinking about discipline, hierarchy, and obedience to the state rather than to custom. Progress came unevenly, producing moments of strength alongside periods of instability. Economic pressures further strained the imperial structure. Integration into global markets brought both opportunity and dependency. European manufactured goods flooded Ottoman markets, undermining local industries, while foreign loans tied imperial finances to external interests. The state responded with fiscal reforms, new banks, and infrastructure projects, attempting to regain control over its economy without dismantling the social order that sustained it. Survival increasingly depended on managing vulnerability rather than eliminating it. At the same time, the empire continued to govern through negotiation. Minority populations were no longer simply religious communities, they were increasingly influenced by nationalist ideas spreading from Europe. The Ottoman response was complex and often cautious. Rather than immediate repression, the state experimented with inclusion, constitutionalism, and shared political identity. The goal was not to erase difference, but to reframe loyalty in a changing world. Constitutional movements, briefly realized and then suppressed, revealed both the limits and ambitions of Ottoman adaptability. They demonstrated a willingness to rethink sovereignty itself, even as internal divisions and external pressures undermined these experiments. Each reform attempt carried risks, yet the state repeatedly chose engagement with modernity over withdrawal from it. War, however, remained an unavoidable force shaping imperial fate. Conflicts in the Balkans, the Caucasus, and the Middle East drained resources and eroded territory. Still, the empire did not collapse at the first sign of defeat. Administrative systems continued to function, taxes were collected, courts operated, and governance persisted even as borders contracted. This persistence underscored the depth of institutional resilience built over centuries. By the early 20th century, the Ottoman Empire had been transformed from a conquering dynasty into a complex, reforming state struggling to assert relevance in a world dominated by industrial powers. Its survival into this era was not accidental. It was the result of long habits of compromise, adjustment, and endurance formed far earlier, on distant frontiers and in crowded imperial cities, where flexibility had always been the difference between disappearance and survival. The Ottoman Empire ultimately did not fall because it lacked strength, intelligence, or vision. It fell because the world it had been built to govern no longer existed. The political order of empires, dynasties, and negotiated loyalties gave way to an age of nation-states, industrial warfare, and mass mobilization. In that transformation, the Ottomans faced challenges that no amount of gradual reform could fully resolve. When the empire entered the First World War, it did so not as a decaying relic, but as a state still capable of mobilization, administration, and resistance. Even in defeat, its institutions functioned until the final moments. The empire dissolved through treaties, occupations, and political decisions, not sudden collapse. Its end was administrative and legal as much as it was military. What makes the Ottoman Empire remarkable is not simply that it lasted for 6 centuries, but how it lasted. Across generations, it adapted without losing coherence, governed diversity without constant fragmentation, and absorbed crisis without immediate disintegration. Its endurance reshaped the lives of millions across 3 continents and left institutions, borders, and traditions that continued long after the empire itself ceased to exist. The Ottoman story is, at its core, a story of survival through balance. Between tradition and change, authority and flexibility, faith and pragmatism, the empire endured far beyond the lifespan of most historical states. Its longevity was not an accident of history, but the result of choices made repeatedly, over centuries, to adjust rather than shatter when confronted with a changing world.